They followed an awful smell. If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house while they are at work and swap out all their regular decaf coffee with the strongest, most caffeinated espresso you can find. Let's see how their Tuesday goes. N. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night, not because of a startling noise or a bad dream, but because the air in your bedroom has suddenly turned thick and heavy. You take a breath, and your stomach immediately, violently drops. It's a smell so dense, so absolutely foul, that it pulls you straight out of a dead sleep. Your mind races, right? You think, maybe a sewer pipe burst? Maybe a stray animal crawled under the floorboards and died? You don't think, I need to call the police right now. Because, honestly, regular people don't jump straight to the worst-case scenario. They jump to plumbing. They look for logical, boring answers. And that human instinct to normalize the abnormal is exactly how the true horror in today's story went unnoticed for entirely too long. N. NTT, it was late July in a totally unremarkable suburb of a mid-sized Midwestern town. This was one of those sprawling, sleepy neighborhoods where the houses were mostly built in the late 70s. The driveways all had those same slight cracks in the concrete, and everyone kind of just kept to themselves. You might wave to your neighbor when you're both out getting the junk mail at the same time, but you don't really know their last name. Our story follows a guy named Mark. Mark was 34, working a mid-level IT job from home, and his days were profoundly, beautifully mundane. Stale coffee at 8 a.m., staring at spreadsheets until 4, and taking his golden retriever, Buster, for a slow walk around the cul-de-sac at 5. It was just a normal, quiet life. Mark lived alone, his house was reasonably clean, and he certainly wasn't looking for any excitement. N. But then, on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, Mark stepped out onto his back patio to smoke a cigarette. Now, at this point, it was pushing 95 degrees outside. High humidity, the air was thick, almost hard to breathe. And as soon as he slid open that glass door, it hit him. Just a wall of something sickly, sweet, and rotten. It was faint, but it was undeniably there. Mark actually paused, his lighter hovering halfway to his face. He lowered his hand and just stood there for a second, sniffing the stagnant air. It sort of smelled like when you forget to take the trash out before leaving for a long weekend, but mixed with something distinctly metallic and heavy. N.N. Hay walked over to his wooden fence and peered over into his neighbor's yard. The house next door was a rental, currently occupied by a quiet, older guy who supposedly worked graveyard shifts. Mark rarely saw him. The lawn over there was a little overgrown, the blinds were tightly drawn, and a solitary trash can sat baking in the driveway. Nothing looked obviously out of place. So, Mark just rationalized it. He figured, okay, the guy left some meat in the garbage, the summer heat is just cooking it, and the wind is blowing it my way. Gross, but whatever. He went back inside, washed his hands, and completely brushed it off. At the time, this didn't seem strange. You don't call the city over a bad smell in the middle of summer. You just lock your sliding door and close your windows. But that slight hesitation on the patio, that moment where his brain registered the smell as wrong before his logic overrode it, that actually mattered later. Because what Mark was smelling wasn't hot garbage. It was the very beginning of a nightmare. Over the next 3 days, the heat wave didn't break. It just sat on top of the neighborhood like a wet wool blanket. Mark kept his windows locked tight, relying on the hum of his central AC to keep the Texas summer at bay. But by Thursday afternoon, the smell had found its way inside. It started in the mudroom, right by the back door, introducing this heavy, metallic stench that coated the very back of your throat. Buster, Mark's golden retriever, started acting genuinely strange. Normally, Buster would spend 20 minutes sniffing every inch of the wooden fence separating their yard from the neighbors. But now, Buster would walk out onto the patio, take one sniff of the stagnant air, do a hard plant with his front paws, and immediately pull back toward the glass door, whining. And honestly, at first, Mark was just annoyed. He was working from home, trying to lead Zoom calls with this lingering scent of decay creeping through his air vents. He was getting so frustrated, he briefly considered politely asking the like button to climb over the fence in a hazmat suit and investigate, but instead, he just assumed it was a dead raccoon or a possum under his neighbor's deck. It happens all the time in these older suburbs. So, finally, on Friday evening, Mark couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a flashlight, marched out to the fence line, and dragged over a plastic step stool to peer into his neighbor's yard, fully intending to leave a polite but firm note on the guy's door about pest control. But as his head cleared the top of the fence, he saw his neighbor, a quiet, gaunt guy named Arthur, struggling to drag 3 heavy black contractor bags out of his back door and down the driveway. Arthur looked utterly exhausted, his shirt soaked in sweat. He spotted Mark looking over the fence, and he immediately froze. For a second, there was this incredibly awkward, heavy silence. But then Arthur let out a long sigh, wiped his forehead, and walked over. He looked deeply embarrassed. "Man, I am so sorry," Arthur said, pointing a thumb back toward the heavy bags. "My deep freezer in the garage died while I was out of town this weekend. I hunt, and I lost almost 100 pounds of venison. The heat just completely ruined it before I got back. It is absolutely rancid." Now at the key, and Mark felt a massive rush of relief. It made perfect sense. A freezer full of rotting meat in 5-degree heat? Duh. That would explain the horrendous, metallic, sickly sweet smell perfectly. It was a logical, very human, completely gross explanation. Mark even laughed a little, told Arthur not to worry about it, and went back inside, fully satisfied. He even told his coworkers about the gross neighbor meat story the next morning. The mystery was solved. At least, that's what he thought. But the truth began to unravel just 48 hours later. By Sunday morning, the neighborhood garbage trucks had already come and gone. Arthur's driveway was completely empty. The black contractor bags had been hauled away to the city dump. The source of the smell was physically gone. So Mark stepped out onto his patio with his morning coffee, expecting to finally take a deep breath of fresh air. Instead, the smell hit him so hard, his eyes literally watered. It wasn't gone. It was worse. It was sharper, more aggressive, paralyzing in its intensity. Mark just stood there, his coffee cup trembling slightly, his rational brain completely failing to compute what was happening. He walked slowly toward the fence line, looking for any leftover trash or leakage on the concrete. But what he saw instead made his stomach completely drop. There was a massive swarm of large, iridescent green blowflies, hundreds of them, buzzing with this frantic electric energy. But they weren't swarming the trash cans or the garage where the freezer supposedly broke. They were clustered around the edges of Arthur's master bedroom window, desperately trying to squeeze through the tight cracks in the weather stripping. And that is when a terrifying contradiction clicked into place in Mark's head. Arthur had specifically said the freezer broke while he was out of town over the weekend. But Mark suddenly remembered sitting in his living room late Saturday night, hearing the loud, rhythmic thumping of power tools coming through the shared wall from Arthur's house. Arthur hadn't been out of town at all. And honestly, at that exact moment, Mark's brain just sort of short-circuited. He stood there on his patio, his eyes darting between the empty driveway where the black bags used to be, and the master bedroom window, which was practically vibrating with hundreds of frantic, iridescent green blowflies. The math was incredibly simple, but his mind simply refused to do it. If Arthur was out of town all weekend, who was running the power tools on Saturday night? And if the rotting meat was thrown away in those contractor bags, why was the smell currently bleeding out of a sealed bedroom window? Mark slowly took a step back, then another. He didn't turn around, he just walked backward toward his own sliding glass door, his eyes glued to Arthur's house. He stepped inside, slid the glass door shut, and, in a totally irrational but deeply human moment of panic, he locked it. As if a lock could keep out a smell. He sat down on his living room couch. The house was quiet. just the low, steady hum of his central air conditioning. He sat there for a full 20 minutes, holding a cold cup of coffee, paralyzed by the awkwardness of what to do next. You don't just call the cops on your neighbor because his house smells, and you think he lied about his weekend plans, right? Mark tried to talk himself out of it. Maybe Arthur let a friend borrow his house to do renovations. Maybe a raccoon died in the wall. You're being dramatic. But every time the AC kicked off, the silence in the room allowed Mark's memory of that metallic, sickly sweet odor to creep back in. It was a smell, right, that felt like a warning. Finally, feeling like an overreacting nuisance, Mark called the local police non-emergency line. He stuttered through the explanation. Hi, I feel really stupid even calling this in, but my neighbor's house smells really bad. And there's this massive swarm of flies. I just want to make sure he's okay, or, I don't know, maybe do a welfare check? It took almost 2 hours for a single squad car to slowly roll down the street. It was Sunday afternoon, the neighborhood was completely dead, and the two officers who stepped out of the cruiser looked hot, tired, and profoundly bored. Mark was out to his front yard to meet them, apologizing profusely for dragging them out here. "It's fine, sir. We get these all the time," the older officer sighed, adjusting his heavy-duty belt. Probably a dead stray under the crawlspace. The two officers casually walked up Arthur's driveway. They knocked on the front door. No answer. They peered through the front living room window. Nothing. Then Mark watched as the younger officer unlatched the side gate and walked into Arthur's backyard, heading toward the master bedroom window. The officer's posture was completely relaxed until he got within about 10 feet of the glass. Mark saw the exact moment the smell hit him. The officer stopped dead in his tracks. His casual demeanor evaporated instantly. He put a hand over his nose and mouth, violently recoiled, and immediately placed his other hand on the radio on his shoulder. He didn't yell, but his voice was tight and urgent. "Dispatch, I need a supervisor at this address right now. And grab a warrant, Judge. We have a 10 to 54, and it's not a broken freezer." Now, at this point, the pacing of the entire afternoon shifted from a lazy Sunday to a kinetic, high-stakes emergency. Within 30 minutes, Mark's quiet, boring suburban street was flooded with unmarked cars, crime scene tape, and men in thick white hazmat suits. Mark was told to stay inside his house, so he spent the next few hours pacing behind his blinds, watching his normal world turn into a waking nightmare. Eventually, they breached the house. And what they found inside completely shattered the lie Arthur had told at the fence line. When the police got to the master bedroom, the door wouldn't open. It wasn't locked, it had been permanently sealed shut from the inside with industrial construction adhesive and heavy-duty deck screws. The police had to literally break the door frame with a pry bar to get in. Inside the room, all the furniture had been pushed to the walls. The carpet had been violently ripped up, leaving bare plywood. And sitting dead center in the room was a massive, hastily constructed wooden crate. It was nailed together with scrap lumber and completely smothered in thick, yellow streaks of expanding foam and silver duct tape, desperately trying to create an airtight seal. Arthur Times had Times told Mark the truth about one thing. His deep freezer had broken over the weekend in the 95-degree heat. But the freezer was not full of venison. For the last 6 months, Arthur's deep freezer had been holding the remains of his ex-fiancée, a woman the entire neighborhood assumed had peacefully moved back to Ohio after a bad breakup. When the freezer's compressor completely died on Friday, the frozen remains began to rapidly thaw. By Saturday night, the smell was leaking out into the house. Arthur panicked. The rhythmic, heavy thumping of power tools Mark heard through the wall wasn't Arthur doing late-night home repairs. It was Arthur frantically building a wooden containment box to hide her rapidly decomposing body. And those extremely heavy black contractor bags that Arthur threw away, the ones Mark watched the garbage truck compact that morning, those bags contained the actual deep freezer itself, which Arthur had spent the weekend destroying with an angle grinder, chopping it into unrecognizable chunks of metal and plastic so he could throw the evidence away like normal household trash. Later that evening, long after the coroner's van had driven away, Mark sat alone on his couch in the dark. The physical smell had mostly been scrubbed by the evening breeze, but he could still taste it in the back of his throat. The emotional aftermath was completely paralyzing. He kept replaying the conversation at the fence. He remembered smiling. He remembered laughing and telling Arthur, "Oh man, ruined meat, that sucks." He had looked a murderer in the eye, inhaled the scent of a dead woman, and told the guy not to worry about it. But the final, lingering aftershock, the detail that would keep Mark awake for months, came 2 days later when a detective knocked on his door to take a formal statement. They sat at Mark's dining table going over the timeline. Mark explained how he had gone out to his patio to complain about the smell around 6 p.m. on Sunday and how Arthur had jogged over to the fence line to apologize. The detective stopped writing. He slowly looked up from his notepad, his expression totally flat. Based on the blood evidence in the room and the timeline of the concrete he was mixing, the detective said quietly, "Arthur was in the absolute middle of transferring her remains from the broken freezer into that wooden box when he heard you loudly complaining in your backyard." The detective let that hang in the air for a second. When he walked over to that fence to talk to you, he had literally just taken off his bloody gloves. He just paused his work to come calm you down. And honestly, Mark, if you hadn't bought his story about the deer meat and you had pushed him on it, you were standing 3 feet away from a man with a circular saw, alone in your backyard, and nobody else was around. The demolition of Elmwood Avenue. When police finally walked into the split-level home on Elmwood Avenue in Staten Island, seasoned detectives actually stopped in their tracks. It wasn't just the sheer violence of the scene. It was the house itself is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. The drywall in the living room had been violently torn down to the wooden studs. Floorboards in the narrow hallway were pried up, their rusted nails bent and sticking out like jagged teeth. The pink fiberglass insulation was ripped out of the ceiling in massive chunks, scattered across the hardwood like dirty, toxic snow. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. And honestly, at first glance, the first responders thought they were walking into the aftermath of a botched home renovation. Or maybe a freak gas explosion. But it wasn't an explosion. Somebody had systematically, obsessively torn this house apart with a crowbar and their bare hands. They weren't just destroying the property, they were looking for something inside the walls. Or maybe they were looking for a way out. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. But to understand how a quiet suburban home became a chaotic, gutted crime scene, we have to rewind just 3 weeks. Back to a time when the house was whole, and its owner was still alive. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. It's October 8th. The air in Staten Island has just started to get that sharp autumn bite to it. We meet Clara Vance. She's 31 years old, a pediatric physical therapist, and she has just purchased this house. It's her first home. A modest, slightly dated split level that she saved up for years to afford. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. Clara's life right now is a messy, exhausting blur of mundane adult milestones. She spends her days helping kids recover from sports injuries, and her nights painting over ugly 1980s wallpaper while drinking lukewarm, day-old coffee. If you looked through her windows during that first week, you wouldn't see a victim. You'd see a normal person sitting cross-legged on the floor, eating takeout pad thai amidst a fortress of moving boxes, sorting through a pile of junk mail and credit card offers. Is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. The neighborhood itself is incredibly quiet. You can hear the distant low drone of the Staten Island Expressway if the wind blows right, but mostly it's just the sound of wind chimes and the occasional annoyingly loud leaf blower from the guy across the street. It's safe. It's boring. It's exactly what Clara wanted. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. But a house that has stood for 40 years has its own quirks, its own settling noises. And at first, that's all Clara thinks she's dealing with. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. The first sign that something was wrong, the very first disturbance, was so minor, you or I probably would have ignored it entirely. Is less than. BR is greater than. Is less than. BR is greater than. It's a Tuesday evening, October 15th. Clara comes home from a long, exhausting 12-hour shift. It's raining, that heavy, cold October rain that chills you to the bone. She does her normal routine, unlocks the heavy wooden front door, drops her keys in the ceramic bowl on the entryway table, and kicks off her wet sneakers. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. As she walks down the hall, she shivers. It is freezing inside the house. Is less than BR is greater than is less than. BR is greater than. She glances at the thermostat on the wall. It's an old, yellowed plastic dial, and it's turned all the way down to 55 degrees. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. Now, at this point, if you're Clara, your mind does not immediately jump to, there is an intruder in my home. Human beings don't work like that. We rationalize. Clara stands there in the dim hallway, her wet socks soaking into the hardwood, and she just stares at the dial. She frowns, her mind working through a tired checklist. Did I bump it with my shoulder this morning when I was carrying out the trash? Is the wiring faulty? She physically lingers there for a long moment, a slight knot of annoyance forming in her stomach. Not fear, just the creeping dread of an unexpected repair bill. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. She sighs, turns the dial up to 70, and walks into the kitchen to put the kettle on. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. She fills the kettle, sets it on the stove, and waits. The kitchen is dead silent, save for the steady drumming of rain against the window pane. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. Then she hears it. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. It's not a crash. It's not a cinematic footstep. It is a soft, rhythmic times thump. 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 Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. It sounds like it's coming from directly beneath her feet. From inside the floor vents, is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. Clara freezes. The kettle hasn't started whistling yet. She tilts her head, her breath catching slightly in her throat, straining to listen over the sound of the rain. Thump, thump. It's faint, muffled by the aluminum ductwork. Like a heavy book being dropped, over and over, in the crawl space. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. She tells herself it's just the old pipes expanding as the heat finally kicks on. That's what old houses do, right? They make noises. They settle. They breathe. Is less than BR is greater than. Is less than BR is greater than. But as Clara stares down at the metal grate on the floor, she notices something else. Something she definitely didn't do. The screws holding the vent cover to the floor are completely gone, and the metal grate is sitting slightly crooked, pushed up just a fraction of an inch from the wood. Clara stares at the crooked metal grate. For a long, uncomfortable minute, she doesn't move. She just breathes, listening. The thumping has completely stopped. Now, honestly, I think a lot of us like to imagine we'd grab a weapon, or run out the front door, or call 911 right then and there. But Clara doesn't. Because in real life, you don't want to be the crazy person who calls the cops over a loose floor vent. She kneels down, her knees popping on the cold hardwood, and uses her index finger to lift the heavy iron grate. A rush of stale, freezing air hits her face. It smells heavily of damp earth and old metallic dust. She pulls out her phone, flicks on the flashlight, and shines it down into the duct. But there's nothing. Just the ridged silver tubing disappearing into the pitch-black crawl space of her Staten Island foundation. Suddenly, the kettle on the stove behind her shrieks, making her jump so hard she drops the grate. It clatters loudly into place. Her heart is hammering against her ribs, but the immediate scare breaks the tension. She lets out a shaky breath, rubs her eyes, and goes to make her tea. The next morning, Wednesday, the heavy rain has cleared up, leaving that crisp, bright October air. Clara is standing in her kitchen, drinking a cup of slightly burnt coffee from the pot she set on an automatic timer, looking out at the garbage trucks rumbling down her street. She decides to call her landlord, an older guy named Sal who manages a few properties in the borough. She tells him about the thermostat, the freezing house, and the loose vent. Sal immediately groans on the other end of the line. "Ah, geez, Clara. I'm sorry. I should have texted you. I had the HVAC guys doing winter prep on the block yesterday. I told them to pop in and bleed the radiators, check the subfloor ducts. Guys probably bumped the thermostat and forgot to screw your vent back in." When Clara hears that, it feels like a physical weight is lifted off her chest. She actually laughs, feeling completely ridiculous for being so spooked the night before. "Oh, thank God," she tells Sal. "I was starting to think I had a ghost." Sal chuckles, tells her he'll yell at the contractors, and they hang up. It makes perfect sense. It is the logical, boring explanation we all crave when we're scared. And for the next 5 days, Clara goes back to normal. This is the breathing room, where life just happens. She works her exhausting shifts. She sorts through junk mail on the counter, mostly credit card pre-approvals and damp grocery flyers. She complains about her sore feet. But slowly, subtly, the house starts to feel off. It's not a sudden jump scare. It's a creeping, uncomfortable misalignment of her reality. On Friday, her favorite paring knife isn't in the drying rack where she left it. She finds it sitting randomly on the bathroom counter. On Saturday morning, she notices a thin layer of fine white powder drywall dust coating the edge of her dining room table. At the time, Clara just rationalizes it. She's exhausted. Working 12-hour shifts on your feet scrambles your brain. Think about how many times you've misplaced your phone or your keys while you were tired. You don't assume a stalker broke in to move them. You assume you're just losing your mind a little bit. But then comes Monday. Clara gets home around 6 p.m. The house is warm this time, but as she walks down the hallway taking off her jacket, she feels a strange crunch under her sneakers. She looks down. There is a trail of wood shavings and tiny chips of plaster scattered across the hardwood, leading right up to the wall. She follows the trail with her eyes. The decorative wooden baseboard near the floor has been physically pried away from the drywall. The rusty nails are exposed, sticking out like jagged teeth. Clara freezes. She drops her purse. The rationalizations are crumbling. Her phone vibrates in her pocket, shattering the dead silence of the hallway. She jumps, fumbling to pull it out. It's Sal, her landlord. She answers, her voice trembling slightly. "Sal, what the hell did your guys do to my baseboards?" There's a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. "Clara?" Sal says, sounding completely confused. "What are you talking about?" "The HVAC guys?" Clara says, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "The guys you sent last week. Did they come back?" "Clara." Sal's voice drops, losing all of its usual gruff Staten Island bluster. "I didn't send anyone last week. The HVAC guys canceled on me. They're actually scheduled to come to your place tomorrow morning." The silence that follows in Clara's hallway is suffocating. She looks down at the pried open baseboard. She looks slowly back toward the floor vent in the kitchen. If Sal didn't send anyone, who unscrewed the grate? And who is dismantling her home from the inside out? Clara slowly lowers the phone. The line goes dead, and suddenly, the ambient hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen sounds deafening. We know from phone records that Clara didn't call 911 immediately, and honestly, if you put yourself in her shoes for a second, that makes sense. Human beings don't instantly jump to, "There is a monster in my house." They hesitate. They doubt themselves. You freeze trying to logic your way out of a nightmare. She spends 3 full minutes just standing in her hallway, clutching her phone. She stares at the pried open baseboards. She thinks about the drywall dust on her dining table. She thinks about the floor vent. And then she hears it. It isn't a footstep from upstairs. It's a soft, rhythmic shifting. The sound of weight being distributed. And it's coming from times inside, times the wall separating the kitchen from the hallway, right next to her shoulder. Clara finally dials 911 at 6:14 p.m. We know from the dispatch audio that she is whispering. She tells the operator that someone is breaking into her home, but she sounds horribly confused, telling the dispatcher, "I think they're inside the house. No, I think they're inside the walls." At 6:16 p.m., the 911 recording captures a loud, violent crash. The sound of drywall physically buckling and splintering. Then, a brief struggle, the phone dropping to the hardwood, and dead silence. When Staten Island detectives arrive at 6:32 p.m., the front door is wide open. The neighborhood is perfectly quiet, just the distant sound of a leaf blower a few streets over. But inside Clara's house, it looks like a demolition zone. Clara is found in the living room. I won't linger on the violence of the scene, because the tragedy of her death is awful enough. But what confused the initial responders, what made seasoned detectives stop and stare, was the state of the house itself. At first, they assumed it was a frantic burglary. But burglars toss drawers and flip mattresses. They don't take a crowbar to the architectural skeleton of a house. The baseboards in the hallway were completely ripped away. The heavy bathroom mirror had been unscrewed and pushed outward. The air vents were completely detached. It wasn't until crime scene investigators climbed into the small, cramped crawl space above the ceiling that the darkest truth of this case finally came to light. Her killer hadn't just broken in that afternoon. He had been living inside the walls of her home for at least 3 weeks. Now at this point, you have to understand the layout. Staten Island homes from that era often have deep wall cavities to accommodate old plumbing and heating ducts. The killer, a transient man with multiple stalking priors who had noticed Clara walking home from her shifts, had slipped in through an unsecured basement window weeks earlier. He hadn't been taking her baseboards apart to get into the walls. He was dismantling her house from the inside out so he could navigate the structure without ever stepping foot in her hallways. The emotional aftermath of this discovery shattered the community. Neighbors began obsessively checking their locks, calling contractors to inspect their attics, and unscrewing their own vents. Clara's landlord, Sal, was practically inconsolable, haunted by the realization that Clara's complaints about the maintenance men were actually her reporting her own killer's movements. Investigators documented the killer's nest in the crawlspace. It is a deeply disturbing catalog of mundane horror. They found flattened cardboard boxes used as a mattress. They found empty plastic bottles of iced tea. They found damp, stale food wrappers. But the final detail, the one that still keeps the lead detectives awake at night, was found tucked into the fiberglass insulation right above Clara's bathroom. They found Clara's missing paring knife. He hadn't just stolen it to use as a weapon. He had used it to slowly, methodically shave away the drywall behind her bathroom mirror until only a paper-thin layer of paint remained. He had poked a tiny hole through that paint, no larger than a pinprick, directly at eye level. When Clara was exhausted, standing at her sink after a 12-hour shift, washing her face, thinking she was completely alone, he had been standing in the dark, inches away, just watching her breathe.